Someone recently asked me what my thoughts were on the recent events pertaining to Israel. And aside from that, I notice, a lot of times when there's criticisms of Israel, a lot of people want to just brush it off as anti-Semitism. And I'm here to say that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So when you see critics of Israel like Ilhan Omar saying stuff like Israel has hypnotized the world, may Allah awaken the people and help him see the evil doings of Israel, it's not anti-Semitic, you guys. It's just criticism of Israel, although as you can see, as Claire Voltaire pointed out, I didn't know this, but this particular tweet is from November of 2012. I guess Ilhan Omar tweeted this just 2 days after Hamas attacked Israel with over 100 rockets. Now, some may say, well, look, it might be a coincidence. Probably just a mistake, you guys.
Whoopsie daisy.
After all, people do make mistakes. Kind of like another long critic of Israel, another sitting member of the House of Representatives, Rashida Tlaib. She got in hot water back in December for retweeting someone who said, from river to sea, Palestine will be free. And I guess this slogan has long been associated with anti-Semitic groups and movements that seek to completely destroy Israel. But I guess Rashida Tlaib, it was a mistake, a whoopsie daisy.
Whoopsie daisy.
She took it back. She undid the retweet. So, nothing to see here, guys. It's just criticism of Israel. Kind of like a couple of years ago, Mark Lamont Hill, who is a professor at Temple University. He's also been a commentator on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, or CNBC. He also did a speech where he mentioned the river to sea line and was criticized. He had to walk it back. He didn't really, when he said that, he didn't mean the destruction of Israel. So again,
whoopsie daisy.
Guys, mistakes happen, okay? Don't really think too much about this. Even Ron Paul, the libertarian hero Ron Paul, he's made some goofs before. He once, tweeted this anti-Semitic meme. It's generally racist when you really look at it, but it definitely has the anti-Semitic trope. And he eventually, as you can see, he had to apologize, saying, hey guys, it was just a staff member, posted an offensive cartoon, my bad.
Whoopsie daisy.
And Claire Voltaire even mentioned Linda Sarsour recently. I guess Linda Sarsour is now speaking out against anti-Semitism, and good for her. Anti-Semitism is bad, but I guess a couple of years ago, Linda Sarsour said something along the lines of, don't humanize Israel, which some may say is problematic. But look, people make mistakes. People, they get caught up. They use talking points that they don't understand. Let's be fair. Let's be compassionate here. Let's be forgiving, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But even after recent events in Israel, there have been a lot of what some people may call peaceful protests. A lot of peaceful protests from Palestinians. Let's check out this story from KTLA. Check this out.
And you can see a group of about a dozen men approaching the restaurant, and a smaller group of men. That fight quickly breaks out. Several items and punches are thrown, all as people were dining outdoors. A witness recorded the video. She says she was sitting outdoors with her girlfriends having dinner last night when a caravan of Palestinian supporters were driving by, waving flags from their cars and shouting at diners. She says a group of men in a few cars jumped out of their cars and asked the patrons who of them were Jews. The witness says two patrons said they were Jews, and protesters started to beat them. Restaurant staff.
Protesters, you guys. They're protesters. They're just harshly criticizing Israel. Just going up to random people in California. And for those who are not experts on geography, California is a place that's about 7,500 miles from Israel, and asking random people if they're Jewish, and then attacking them. Definitely not anti-Semitic, you guys. We also had other events in New York City.
The gays.
Chaos in Times Square last night as someone riding in a pro-Palestinian caravan tossed fireworks into a crowd of Jewish pro-Israel protesters. A 29-year-old Jewish man was also attacked by a mob of men. One who used a crutch as a weapon was later charged with a hate crime.
That's right. That's how people criticize Israel these days, by just throwing explosives at random Jewish people in New York City, which, again, for the people who are not experts on geography, is about 5,700 miles from Israel. That's really how you criticize Israel, is you harass and intimidate and assault random Jewish people who are not in Israel, thousands of miles away. Then we have this protest that I saw earlier today.
More factors.
This was in Philadelphia.
More factors, but there's three key factors to highlight in all of this. First thing is their
three key factors, he says.
Highlight in all of this. First thing is their control of the media. Through control.
Who's control of the media?
The media, they stigmatize certain words. They stigmatize certain words and weaponize other words. For example,
they weaponize other words.
Hamas, Gaza, Palestine. It's considered political suicide, or just suicide to your career in general, to speak up for Palestine. But yet, speaking up for Israel...
Is he making a package deal out of Palestine and Hamas?
That's the right thing to do. That's what they tell us, at least, right?
So I guess if they're controlling the media, I don't know. I cited KTLA and CBS in New York. Maybe I shouldn't trust them. Who knows?
The second way they do it is they are all united, Zionists in general. Now, a lot of them are incentivized. But if you notice, whenever someone speaks up about Palestine or against Israel, they're met with a brutal force. And they're all saying the same thing. It's very coincidental. See, all of us here, we act on our own accord. That's why none of us are saying the same thing. Now, the third way that they manipulate is through lobbyists who pressure our politicians. You cannot be elected in the United States of America if you support Palestine, with the exception of the Congress people that we have today.
Come on.
All right, so I guess you could say this one in Philly was more peaceful, although more Hitler-like rhetoric. I mean, more criticism of Israel. Sorry, folks.
Whoopsie daisy.
Almost stigmatized his language there. Okay, all joking aside, in all fairness, not all protests on behalf of Palestine have been violent or have had anti-Semitic rhetoric. Last week, when President jibber-jabbering Joe Biden went to Dearborn, Michigan to drive some electric trucks, and I guess he jokingly threatened to run over some journalists while he was in that electric truck. Check it out. But while jibber-jabbering Joe Biden was in Dearborn, Michigan, there were some protests against Joe Biden in Dearborn because he had recently sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel. And from what I saw, I watched video of these protests. They looked peaceful and they looked rather short on anti-Semitism. So don't assume that anyone that's waving a flag of Palestine is violent or anti-Semitic. But this goes back to the overall point that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Now, a lot of people share this sentiment. As you can see, there's a major intentional PR effort to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. This is an older tweet from the Amazing Atheist, going at Ben Shapiro. Anti-Semitism. You use the anti-Semite label to deflect criticism of Israel and yourself. A lot of people saying that. It's just criticism of Israel, guys. Not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Now, while this is technically true, you can criticize Israel's government and foreign policy without hating Jews. And Israel's government and foreign policy, I would say, are worthy of criticism. For one, Israel has socialized medicine, which is dumb. And on foreign policy, I would say that Israel is not as tough as they need to be. So eat that hot take with your hotcakes, folks. So yes, you can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic, but people really need to stop acting like there are not some ominous signs of anti-Semitism from so many so-called critics of Israel. And often, if the criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, it ranges from what I would call ignorantly naive platitudes to straight up support for Israel's enemies like Hamas. Now you might be thinking, whoa, Kirk, calm down. Nobody supports Hamas. You know, the political organization that rules over the Gaza Strip next to Israel, and according to many sources, wants to destroy Israel and establish an Islamic theocracy, an Islamic state over what is now Israel. And we all know that Islamic theocracies are just, they're just bastions of freedom.
What a sick joke!
Anyway, all joking aside, you might be saying, come on, Kirk. Hamas is engaged in terrorism and they've long been wrongfully hostile toward Israel. You might be saying, it's just criticism of Israel. Nobody outside of the Middle East supports Hamas.
Of Pakistanis at the lowest. That's at least 40 of them are not sure. Like 40 of them are like, well, maybe attacks on civilians.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unironically, again, if you've been subjected to the same shit that people in the Middle East have, yeah, unquestionably. Is it going to surprise you guys that I generally support Hamas as well?
Well, I would say...
No surprise there!
Now, this was about a year ago, April 6th of 2020, as you can see. Maybe this gentleman might have changed his stance on whether or not he generally supports Hamas. Although recently, this communist dipshit, or I guess he calls himself a libertarian socialist, whatever the hell that means. Guess he held a fundraiser, a live stream to raise funds to give to a charity that claims to help Palestinians, children in Palestinian territory like the Gaza Strip who have been hurt by the war, by recent actions. And maybe some of that money will go to help refugees and victims in the Gaza Strip. Although, according to Elon Journo's book, What Justice Demands, Hamas, as you can see, has a long history of raising funds for their military ambitions and for terrorism and jihad under the guise of benevolent charities. So I guess we will see what happens with those funds. But the context of what Hamas wants here is important, because a lot of what I would call ignorantly naive commentators, if I'm being charitable with that description, they talk as if Israel and Hamas are moral equivalents when Hamas wants to obliterate Israel and establish an Islamic theocracy. It's ridiculous to think of the two sides can just get together and negotiate and find some sort of middle ground, like a two-state solution. And again, it's convenient for all of this to come up for when Israel is defending itself from rocket attacks. Like, do people look back at the Nazi invasion of Poland and think, well, a lot of Germans just wanted some Lebensraum and they just wanted to reclaim some of the territory that was lost after World War I.
Blow it out your ass.
A lot of people say stuff like Israel is an apartheid state and that all Palestinians want is some democracy and some voting rights. Meanwhile, you see little to no mention of the fact that the people of the Gaza Strip voted Hamas into power back in 2006, and they have not held elections since. Don't see much pearl clutching over voting rights pertaining to Hamas and the Gaza Strip.
Really makes you think.
And I think I'm going to conclude this by looking at this popular clip of John Oliver that's going around. As you can see, this one on Twitter got about 18,000 retweets, 50,000 likes. I've seen a lot of people post this clip, so let's check it out.
Point is, this isn't tit for tat. There is a massive imbalance.
when it comes to the two sides' weaponry and capabilities.
Now, he makes an issue out of imbalance, and I would say, if you look back at, again, World War II, I would say after the United States successfully tested the atomic bomb, that they had a rather severe power imbalance with the Japanese Empire. And I would say that that worked out rather well.
While most of the rockets aimed toward Israeli citizens this week were intercepted, Israel's airstrikes were not. They hit their targets, including a house in a refugee camp, a building housing the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, and this 13-story office and apartment building. And while Israel insisted that there were military targets in that building and that they destroyed it as humanely as possible, even...
Now, that's a big question. If there were military targets, if there were military personnel and or weapons, military technology or whatnot in those buildings, then who's really responsible for the destruction? Who's really responsible for destroying those buildings?
Warning people to evacuate beforehand. For the record, destroying a civilian residence sure seems like a war crime.
War crime!
Regardless of whether you send a courtesy heads-up text. And when dozens of people have seen their homes or livelihoods destroyed, it doesn't really help that the Israeli military posted this triumphant meme showing the explosion and the rubble labelled before and after. Look what we did. People lived there before, and now they can't.
All right, so I'm not here cheering on destruction. I'm not happy that buildings are getting destroyed or that, civilians are, having their homes destroyed and whatnot. But watching this clip and seeing everyone talk about it made me want to revisit John David Lewis's book, Nothing Less Than Victory, particularly the chapter on the American Civil War. And Lewis explains in this book about how early in the American Civil War, the Union mostly engaged in large-scale military battles and confrontations with the Confederate forces, or as someone like John Oliver might say, tit for tat. And they had virtually no success. The Union Army was losing thousands of soldiers while failing to defeat the Confederacy, sometimes losing battles. And the Union Army was constantly shuffling out generals and figuring out strategy, and it was not until William Tecumseh Sherman was promoted, and instead of fighting tit-for-tat battles, General Sherman instead focused on marching deep into the South, ripping up railroad and infrastructure along the way, and he went to the South to confront political leadership. As you can see here, General Sherman went to meet with, I think, Vice President Alexander Stephens and another Confederate political leader, and they failed to respond to Sherman. As Lewis says, the failure to respond to Sherman was one of the lost opportunities that the Southern leaders had to spare their own people from the consequences of secession. It was after this failed attempt that Sherman wrote to Grant on October 9th, he was going to make Georgia howl. And when the political leaders fled in advance, Sherman's army would burn down public buildings and plantations. Or, as someone like John Oliver might say, General Sherman committed war crimes.
I'm sorry.
I am going to make Georgia howl. General Sherman did this for a few reasons. One, General Sherman wanted to bring the concrete reality of war to the South, so that the people would feel the war. Because before that, while somewhat demoralized Confederate soldiers were experiencing bloodbaths on battlefields, the people back at home in the South thought that everything was just fine and dandy. They were thinking that our boys are going to show those Yankee scum that they can't boss us around and take away our way of life. Many people in the South did not have to experience the war and were under the impression that the Confederacy was winning the war. So Sherman and General Grant wanted to break their spirits to continue the fight. Second, General Sherman tried to focus on the people responsible for dragging the South into this war. And that was the political leadership, the intellectuals, and the plantation owners in the South, who often preached to the commoners and the civilians to fight for your country and fight for your culture. In some cases, there were mayors of cities and whatnot telling everyone to fight to the last man, woman, and child, yet these political leaders in all these cases were the first to flee. When Sherman's forces arrived, they were the first to flee, knowing that knowing that Sherman was coming. When Sherman's forces did arrive, they were often compassionate toward the commoners, the civilians, and he wanted to focus on burning down government buildings and plantations while showing compassion for the residents and small businesses. So not only did Sherman bring the reality of war to the South, Sherman showed the South just how cowardly their political leadership, their elites, and their intellectuals who were pushing for this war, he showed how cowardly they were. This was all a means of an end for Sherman and General Grant, who were seeking to break the morale of the South to fight. They wanted to bring the war to a close as soon as possible, which they did. The war was over within months of General Sherman's campaigns, and General Sherman's strategy probably saved thousands of lives on both sides, as well as the United States, who, to clear any confusion for anyone out there, were the good guys in this dispute. Knowing all of this, does anyone think that someone like John Oliver, if he were alive in, say, 1864 and seeing what General William Tecumseh Sherman was doing, would John Oliver be clutching his pearls over the war crimes that General Sherman was committing to those poor Confederates?
No, of course not.